Company, support arm. Battalion, shoulder, arm. Side, post.
这么多衣服啊，这不这么
咱们下去吧，从那旁边。谁要晒不着了
Attention, battalion. Shoulder, arm.
Order, arm. Parade. First company. Parade, rest.
Second company. Step out, face out. Order, arm. Parade, rest. Music, beat, off. Battalion, present, arm. Sir, parade is formed. Battalion, shoulder, arm. Right shoulder, shift, arm. Shoulder, arm. Support, arm. Shoulder, arm. Order, arm. First sergeant, to the front and center. Mark. Front, hey. Report.
First company, all present or accounted for, sir.
Second company, all present or accounted for, sir.
First sergeant, outward. Hey. Your post. Mark. Attention orders. Immediately following this parade, weapons inspection. From there, we shall proceed to the demonstration area. The parade is dismissed. Front, please. Forward, move. Hold, and salute.
Try.
Woods, the Confederate military forces, and right here at the Pennsylvania Monument, the members of the Mifflin Guard. As long as you keep supporting them, they keep being invited back every year, not only for your enjoyment, but I tell you what, these gentlemen, for the last 15 years, have made my weekend, this anniversary weekend, very stress-free. These gentlemen also make it very low-key, too. So to introduce you to the weapons and the tactics used by the infantry, I would like to introduce you to a gentleman who's been coming here for all those years with the Mifflin Guard. He's extremely knowledgeable about the role and function of the infantry. Going to share some of that knowledge with you, direct from Temple University in Philadelphia. I'd like y'all to meet Mr. Scott Washburn.
All right, well, good morning. In case you hadn't noticed, it's hot. And of course, we're a bit hotter than you are, I think, the wool uniform, so we're going to keep this fairly brief today for the sake of these fellows out here and for me. As the Ranger mentioned, we're going to be talking about the role of the infantry. Now, the infantry made up the bulk of the armies. Most of the troops that fought here at Gettysburg were infantrymen. The cavalry and the artillery, the other two main branches of the service, made up a far smaller percentage of the armies here. And what you see in front of you is a rather small infantry battalion. Consists of 2 companies today. Now, the basic unit of infantry used during the Civil War was the regiment. Now, a regiment would normally have 10 companies in it, and at full strength, each company would have 100 men, so you'd have 1,000 men in a regiment. Now, we've got about 60 men here in 2 small companies, so we're much under strength for an infantry regiment. Most of the regiments that fought here at Gettysburg were badly under strength. Neither army had a good system to provide replacements, and the regiments tended to dwindle away with time. But most of them had more men than we have here. We have 2 companies, so in your imagination, imagine us being about 5 times the size we are now. Say 10 companies with 300 men, and that would be a typical regiment that we would have seen here at the Battle of Gettysburg. The formation the men are in right now is called the line of battle. This was the standard combat formation during the Civil War. As you can see, the men are standing literally shoulder to shoulder and 2 ranks deep. The reason for that was because of the weapon that they were carrying. It was a single-shot rifled musket. The muskets had to be loaded from the muzzle end. It was a fairly complicated procedure. A good, well-trained man was expected to be able to load in about 20 seconds. In actual battlefield practice, it was probably more like 30 seconds. So each man took half a minute to fire 1 shot. That's not a very high rate of fire. So in order to get firepower to really hurt the enemy, they massed the men in formations like this to get the maximum number of weapons firing that they possibly could. To our modern eye, that might seem like a foolish thing to do. They make very good targets, but the generals of the time, they weren't fools, and they realized they were going to take heavy casualties with formations like this, but their objective was to win battles, not avoid casualties. And they felt that by concentrating the maximum amount of firepower on the shortest possible front, that this was the best way to win battles, and it proved to be the case. These tactics were used virtually unchanged from the start of the war until the end of the war, and overall they worked fairly well, although the casualties were high. But the generals knew that this was going to be the case. They, unlike what you might hear sometimes, the generals were not fools. They knew what they were doing. Now, this formation, as I say, is the line of battle, and it's a good combat formation, maximum firepower, but it's not really the most easy formation to move from place to place. The roads that the men marched on in those days were very narrow, unpaved roads for the most part, and a formation like this obviously would not fit down a narrow country lane marching straight ahead. So they had to have other formations to march from place to place. And one of the most common formations was commonly called the column of 4s, or marching by the flank, and I'm going to demonstrate that now. Attention, battalion! Shoulder, arm, right, face. Now you see the men face to the right, and if you look closely, you'll see that they've gone from 2 ranks into 4. That's because each man has a number, either a 1 or a 2. On a right face, all the number 1s just simply face to the right, but all the number 2s step up into the gap between the number 1s, thus opening a little bit of space between each file here. It makes it easier to march. To get back into the line of battle from this formation, the command is simply run! And they're back in their line of battle. They can also face by the left. Battalion, left, face! And the procedure is the same, except in this case, the number 2s stay put, and the number 1s step up. So now they're in a column of 4s facing to the left. Battalion, run! And now they're back into the line of battle again. Now, the tactics they used during the time period called for being able to get the regiment or the battalion from one place to another quickly and then back into this line of battle. So we've seen how they can go from a marching column to a line of battle facing towards you, but if they want to be facing in some other direction when they're done, they need other formations and maneuvers. Now what I'm going to do is turn this thing over to my second in command, Major Berg, and he is going to march the men around and do some firing and so forth, and I'm going to try to explain what he's doing and why while he's doing it. So Major, if you will take command.
Battalion, load!
All right, he is, first thing he's doing is loading his muskets. You must expect that something's going to happen to have loaded muskets. Typically the men would not have their muskets loaded just simply on the march, but he's probably heard rumors of Confederates in the vicinity, so he wants to be prepared. Now, you can watch the loading procedure the men are going through, see how they are pulling a cartridge out of their cartridge box, charging the gunpowder into the weapon, and using the ramrods to tamp down the powder. Obviously, we're not using real bullets here, but if we were, they'd be ramming the bullets into place. And they bring the musket up and have to prime it, put a percussion cap on it, which is what will set the musket off. And you see, it's a fairly lengthy procedure. Again, that's one of the reasons they fought in these tight formations, because it took so long to load the musket one time.
Battalion, right, face!
All right, they face to the right.
What? Up! Battalion, out! Line, company into line! Halt!
They're now doing a maneuver called by company into line. Each of the 2 companies quickly swings out into a line of battle. This forms what's called a column of companies. The companies are one behind the other behind the other. If we were a full-strength regiment, there would be 10 companies lined up in a long column here.
Battalion! On the right, into line! Halt!
Now, the major is reforming the line of battle face to the right of its original direction. See how the first company is swung around. The second company is now moving up into place. And they have quickly reformed their line of battle, but now they are facing in the opposite direction they were a moment ago. Now you might have asked, well, why couldn't they have just simply turned around? And they could have, but that would have reversed the order of companies, reversed the order of the men, and they don't like to do that unless they really have to. Sometimes they would, if there was an emergency and they didn't have time, but in general they like to keep the men in exactly the same order all the time. It made it much easier to keep the men in place. Now they're about to fire here. See how the officers step back out of the line. This isn't because they're cowards, but because they want to be able to see what their men are doing. All right, they fired what was called a battalion volley. Everyone fired at once, front rank and rear rank, all fired their weapons at the same time. Now this could provide a lot of firepower. You have a lot of bullets flying down range all at once, and if they're well aimed, you might actually hit something with them. The weapons they were using were rifles. They were fairly accurate in the hands of a well-trained marksman. A good man who knew his weapon well might be able to hit a target 400 yards away. However, the soldiers in the Civil War armies were given no marksmanship training at all, so in practical terms. Effective range more like about 200 yards.
Firing by company! Captains, fire your company!
First company, ready!
Because of the long loading period, the battalions were often fired sequentially like this, the companies alternating fire. This would provide a more continuous amount of fire going against the enemy rather than one big volley and a 30-second wait until the next shots could be fired. Again, if we had a full-strength regiment here with 10 companies, the fire would have continued on down the line to the left, each company firing in turn. By the time the last company had fired, the first company would be reloaded and ready to fire again, so you can keep a continuous fire against the enemy that way. You see some of the men, there's some men behind the firing line, both the company commanders plus some sergeants. These are known as file closers. They generally would not shoot, but they keep an eye on the men, make certain they're loading properly, keeping the line straight, and making certain nobody runs away. Now they're firing by files. Basically, each 2 men, front and rear rank, fire from the right down to the left. This is another way of spreading out the fire even more. And then typically after firing by file, the men would then fire independently, or what was known as fire at will. This was in fact the most common way that they fired during the war. Even if the officers wanted them to keep firing volleys in ordered sequence, typically once the action got hot, the men would start firing independently on their own.
Sit down.
Alright, the Major's going to advance the battalion. See how the colors are stepping forward a little bit? This is to give the men a visual reference to help them keep the line straight. We've also put the color bearers right out in front, so as you can imagine, quite a lot of color bearers got shot during the course of the war.
Captain, wheel the first company. To the right.
All right, now the Major's going to realign the battalion facing to the right, and the way he does this, several different ways of doing it. The method he's using now is called a change of front. The first company wheels around until it's facing 90 degrees from where it was before, and now the second company will move forward and then align on it. Again, if we had a whole 10-company regiment here, each of the 10 companies would be following along, extending the line as they each came up on the next company in front.
I got videos of yeah. Yeah, I'm just standing on the other side there. I think I'm running my mouth. This is perfect. Get the camera in the smoke. They're going to point out the smoke all over.
Battalion! Firing by battalion!
Okay, we're going to get a better look at the shooting here from the side.
These guys will be doing this all day long.
Finish!
Now you heard the noise, you see the smoke cloud. Now multiply that by a factor of about 1,000 and you'd have an idea what a Civil War battle was like. It's another reason why they fought in these tight formations, so the officers could keep them under control. In a major battle, the noise levels became so high you could barely hear the human voice a few yards away. So if they let the men spread out and take cover and then needed to get them moving again, they wouldn't be able to hear their officers. Now we have a bit of a breeze here today, so the smoke cloud blew away pretty quickly, but on a calm day, the clouds of gun smoke would just hang in the air, and as the firing went on, it would get harder and harder to see as well.
Battalion! Firing by company!
First company, ready! Hey! Fire!
And
bugle standing out there. One of the main ways of transmitting orders, particularly when it got noisy, was by using the bugle. There were all sorts of bugle calls by which various orders could be transmitted.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, it's gonna take a lot of focus to do it.
Together, everybody together.
We're all right over there. Except for Dave. Back a while.
Alright, go, Josh. Try to keep cool.
Thank you, you too.
Load! Battalion! Fire by battalion!
I don't even know, but you can tell anybody else.
Ready!
Don't have anything.
Hey! Fire! Cover! Run!
Smell the powder smoke as it blows over here? That would have been in the eyes and noses of every man on the battlefield. Major action. Now what's happening now is the major isn't going to be firing anymore, but he's ordered the men to prime. They're just putting a percussion cap on the weapon. He's going to fire that. This is a safety precaution to make certain all the weapons are clear. Oftentimes you'll have misfires and the weapon won't go off.
Ready! Hey! Fire!
You see several of the weapons went off. They obviously hadn't gone off when we did the volley just a moment ago. And he will keep firing the percussion caps until we don't have any more weapons going off. Again, this is a safety procedure.
Battalion! Firing by battalion! Ready! Hey! Fire!
Okay. Hopefully all the weapons are clear at this point.
Forward!
The rifles are 58 caliber for the most part. The two primary types of weapons used during the Civil War were the Springfield and the Enfield rifled muskets. There were dozens of others, but the Springfield and the Enfield were the most common. The Springfield was 58 caliber, which means to fire the bullet that was slightly over half an inch in diameter. The Enfield was 5.77 caliber, which is a tiny bit smaller. They could both use the same ammunition. All right, the battalion's wheeling around here.
1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1. Help! Bayonet!
Now, the men carried an additional weapon besides the actual musket itself. They also carried a bayonet, which is this 18-inch triangular metal spike that they could fit on the end of their weapon, essentially turning their musket into a spear. And the bayonet could be used in close hand-to-hand combat if necessary. Now, Now, in fact, there were very few bayonet wounds inflicted during the war because that's what's called facing the cold steel. In fact, bayonet charges, even though, as I said, very few bayonet wounds were inflicted, the sight of a level line of bayonets coming at you was often enough to send troops running. And so a bayonet charge was often a decisive factor in a battle. A line of charging men with bayonets would cause the enemy to give way and retreat rather than face the cold steel. Now, that concludes our demonstration here today. As the ranger mentioned, we are volunteers. We are not park employees. We are not your tax dollars at work. These men are here at their own expense. Their uniforms, equipment, weapons, they all purchased with their own money. The gunpowder they just shot off, again, they purchased with their own money. So they are here as volunteers on a very hot day to try to give you a look at what the Civil War was like. So I think they've earned a round of applause here. Okay, thank you. We're going to be marching back to our camp, which is just across the street. Please feel free to come back with us and take a closer look at our equipment and weapons, our tents and so forth. We're here all day, and please come and talk to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Be in your picture, you don't know who I am.
Third line, choose your sergeant.
So it takes three to stand it.
One goes one, two together, one person. 要不要上去看一下？
Company, halt! Front!
Second company. Halt. Front. Right. Dress.
We'll be marching over to the demonstration area in just a few minutes. So once they take their arms, we're going to head right up the road here.
Come on, lads. Right up to the rifles. Come right up to the rifles. Come on. There you go. Attention, battalion. Take arms. Here comes out.
Nope, we know who they want to.
Quickly, lads. Unstack them. Not rocket science. Not even Professor Lowe's balloon science. Battalion, left, face. Forward, march.
About the tactics and the weapons used on battlefields throughout the American Civil War, I'd like to introduce you to a gentleman who's been coming here for all those years with the Mifflin Guard, extremely knowledgeable about the role and function of these infantry. Going to share some of that knowledge with you right from Temple University, and the Colonel of the Mifflin Guard, Mr. Scott Washburn. Scott.
Thank you, Tom. Well, yes, we're going to talk a bit about the role of the infantry during the Civil War. Now, the infantry, of course, were the men who fought on foot. The other two major branches of the service at the time were the artillery. Those were the men who had the big cannons, and the cavalry, the guys who rode on horses. But the bulk of the armies that fought here at Gettysburg and in most of the battles were the infantry. They made up by far the vast majority of the troops in the armies. They did most of the fighting and took the heaviest casualties. Now, what you're seeing in front of you here is a small, I should say a very small battalion of infantry here. We've got two companies here today. A full-strength regiment would have 10 companies, each company with 100 men, so there'd be 1,000 men in a regiment when it was at full strength. Now, we've got about 60 men here today, so a full-strength regiment would be almost 20 times the size of this. But the regiments that fought at Gettysburg, most of them were actually much smaller than 1,000 men. The armies didn't have much of a replacement system, and the regiments tended to get smaller and smaller as time went by. So an average regiment that fought here at Gettysburg would probably have about 300 men in it, so maybe 5 times the size of this. And as I say, we have 10 companies. We've got 2 companies here, so if you can use your imagination, imagine something about 5 times as big as this, and that would be a typical regiment that fought here at Gettysburg. Now, the men in front of you are standing in a formation that was known as the line of battle. This is the actual combat formation they would have used in battle for the most part. As you can see, they are standing literally shoulder to shoulder and 2 ranks deep. Now, to our modern eyes, that might seem like sort of a foolish way to fight. You make a very good target. But there were reasons why they did this. It wasn't just that the generals were stupid. You might hear this on the History Channel or some place talking about how the weapons had gotten better, but the generals were too stupid to realize that. That's not really the case. It makes a good soundbite, but it just isn't really true. The main reason, so there were several main reasons why they fought like this, but the most important was the nature of the weapons they used. The rifle muskets that they're carrying are fairly accurate in the hands of a trained marksman, but most of the soldiers didn't really have that much training. But the key factor is that it took a long time to load one of these. You'll see the loading procedure in just a moment. And a well-trained man could load one of these in 20 or 25 seconds. In the heat of battle, it might take 30 seconds or more, but the basic idea is that it took half a minute or so for one man to fire one shot. And that meant that a single individual doesn't have a whole lot of firepower. And so the way that they got the firepower was to mass the men together like this and have lots and lots of muskets firing all at the same time on a very narrow frontage, and this would produce a lot of firepower. And of course, the generals were aware that their men would take heavy casualties fighting like this, but the thing that we have to remember is that the objective of the generals was to win battles, not necessarily to avoid taking casualties. And so by massing their men tightly packed together like this, they could use the force that created to win battles. And the armies in the Civil War fought this way pretty much from the start to the end. There were times where they got into sort of a siege situation like in Petersburg and so forth, where they resorted to trenches, but for the most part they fought standing up like this in the open field. That was the way they fought here at Gettysburg and in many of the major battles of the Civil War. So, the men here are in their combat formation. This is the line of battle. It's a good formation to fight in, but it's not real practical if you're trying to move from one spot to another. The roads that existed in those days were generally fairly narrow, and a formation like this obviously just couldn't march down a road in this formation. So they had to have other ways of getting from place to place, and then they needed methods to get from a marching column back into their line of battle very quickly in case they encountered the enemy unexpectedly. So we're going to show you some of the maneuvers that they used to do that. To go from this line of battle into a marching column was fairly simple.
Attention, battalion. Shoulder, arms. Right, face.
Now you see the men have faced to the right, but if you look closely, you'll see they've gone from 2 ranks into 4 ranks. This makes a better marching formation, a little bit of space in between each of the files so they aren't stepping on each other's heels. To get back into the combat formation is quite simple.
Battalion, front.
And you can see they're back into the line of battle. They can also do this facing to the left.
Battalion, left, face.
And the procedure's basically the same. So this formation was called either a column of 4s or marching by the flank. Both terms were used, but this was the common formation for getting from place to place. But then once you'd gotten to where you wanted to be, you needed to be able to get back into the line of battle, and there were a number of different ways of doing that. We're going to demonstrate some of them now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn command of the battalion over to my second in command, and he is going to take the men out and do some marching and firing, and we'll be explaining what he's doing here. So, Major, if you would take over.
Battalion, front! Battalion, load!
Now he's going to have the men load their weapons, so he will be ready in case he encounters the enemy on his march. And you see they're pulling out their cartridges. This was gunpowder and a bullet wrapped in paper. We're not using real bullets, but they tear the cartridge open with their teeth, pour the powder down the barrel, and pull out these long metal rods called ramrods to ram the bullet and the powder down into the barrel tightly. Then they have to apply a percussion cap, which is the priming mechanism, which will actually set off the charge. And they have to do this each and every time they want to fire the gun. So, again, the slow rate of fire was one of the reasons they fought in these mass formations.
Battalion, right? Face! Forward! Up! Halt! Fire company into line! Halt!
Okay, he's now doing a maneuver called by company into line. Each of the companies swings out into its line of battle, and we now have a column with, which is one company wide, and in this case, two companies deep. If we had a full-strength regiment with 10 companies, of course, all the other companies would be stacked up behind here.
Battalion in two ranks, right? Face! Forward! Up!
Yes, we ran afoul of the speaker system here. That was my fault. I should have brought the battalion up a little further away from the line, but he's adjusting his position.
Front! Battalion! On the right, into line! Up!
All right, what's happening here is a maneuver called on the right into line. And what it's doing is we're reforming our line of battle, but we'll be facing it exactly the opposite direction we were before. You see the first company is swung around, establishing the new line, and then the second company comes up and quickly aligns itself on the first company. And if there were any additional companies, they would keep going, extending the line further and further down to the left. It's just one of many of the formations and maneuvers that the soldiers had to learn. They would typically drill 2 or 3 hours each day, learning the multitude of different maneuvers. Okay, we're going to fire a battalion volley here. All the men firing their muskets at once. All right, that was called a volley. All the men, front rank and rear rank together, all fired their weapons off at the same time. And this provided the concentration of firepower I was talking about earlier. You'd be sending a lot of bullets flying down range all at the same time, and hopefully you'd hit something with it. Now, part of the problem, of course, is, though, when it takes 30 seconds or so to load again, you have this long period of time between volleys, and if the enemy was advancing on you, they would know that your weapons weren't loaded, and they might rush forward while you were reloading. So there were ways in which the firing could be spread out a little bit to keep the enemy under a more constant fire.
Battalion, firing by company!
So what's here, we're firing by company, so the companies alternate their fire. The first company fires, but the second company holds its fire for a little while, and then it fires. And again, if we had a full regiment with 10 companies, the fire would go on down the line, and by the time the last company had fired, the first company would be reloaded and it could fire again, keeping the enemy under a more constant fire, although not as many bullets each time.
Battalion, firing by file! Hands firing! Second company, ready!
Okay, now they're doing what's called firing by file, which you see the fire starts at the right end of each company, and then each pair of men in turn fires down the length of the line, and this again spreads out the fire. Typically, after firing by file, the men would then be allowed to fire at will, each one firing independently of all the rest. And this was, in fact, the most common way of firing, even if the officers didn't want them to. It was very hard for a man to stand under fire, waiting the command to shoot when the enemy was shooting at you, and typically the soldiers would very quickly start firing independently, even if the officers didn't want them to.
Battalion,
All right, the battalion's going to advance. See how the men carrying the flag step forward. They're about 6 paces out in front of the line, and that was to provide a sort of visual reference to all the other men to keep the line straight. Of course, it also meant that the guys carrying the flags got shot pretty frequently. Being the color bearer was a very dangerous job. And they told them, of course, it was a great honor to carry the flag, and I guess that was to try to trick them into doing it, and probably killed.
Battalion, change front forward on the first company. Right half wheel.
All right, they're now doing what's called a change of front. They want to change the direction the battalion's facing, from facing away from us to facing off to the right. So the first company swung itself around and onto the new line, and now the second company is taking its position, aligning on it. And again, if we had more companies, each one in turn would be doing the same thing, extending the line further and further out. You see now in a very short time they've swung the whole battalion around 90 degrees, and I'll do some more firings. You get a better look at what the firing looks like from this angle.
Battalion! Firing by battalion! Ready! Aim! Fire!
It sounds a bit louder when it's not faced away from you, doesn't it? You might notice the thick cloud of smoke that it produces, and of course the loud noise it produces. That's another reason why they fought in these tight formations. The only way they had, the officers had to transmit orders was through the spoken voice or to a certain extent the bugle. And with all the noise and smoke and confusion of the battlefield, it became very difficult to get the orders to the men. And if you let the men spread out, it would be even harder to keep them under control. So keeping them in these tight formations was another method of maintaining control over the men.
Firing by company! Commence firing!
First company, ready!
Ooh, that was smoke ring.
I
Deep sea creatures. Yeah. Jellyfish in the air.
And of course the noise and the smoke being produced here was just by about 45 muskets on the line. So multiply that by 1,000 and you've got an idea of what the Battle of Gettysburg was like. There's thousands and thousands of muskets and cannons firing almost continuously. The noise level just becomes so great you can't really hear anything at all but the shooting. And depending on the weather conditions, sometimes the clouds of powder smoke could get so thick you couldn't really see anymore.
Firing by file! Commence firing!
Once again, firing by file. What's happening now is they're not going to be shooting again, so they want to make certain the muskets are clear. They're just priming them. They're just putting a percussion cap on them, and they're going to fire a volley with just the percussion caps to make certain all the muskets have in fact gone off. It's very common to have misfires where the gun doesn't go off. The one on the end there, he fired his weapon during the firing, but it didn't go off. It's still loaded, so they'll prime again, and they'll keep firing off the percussion caps until that doesn't happen again. We have to be very safety conscious here. We don't want to be marching around with a loaded musket.
Ready!
We have another one. On humid days, it gets very difficult. There have been years when we've been out here where we've had to fire 5 or 6 or 8 percussion caps before we got all the muskets to finally all go off. So we'll just keep doing this until we get a clean volley here.
Ready!
Okay, that was good.
On! Shoulder! On! Battalion! Halt! Battalion! Fix! Bayonet!
All right, the soldiers had another weapon besides their rifles. They also carried a bayonet, and this was an 18-inch long triangular steel blade that fit on the end of the musket. You could still load and fire with the bayonet fixed, but what the bayonet did was basically turn your rifle into a spear. And because it did take so long to load, you needed this secondary weapon in case you came upon the enemy at close range and didn't have time to load. Now the regiment's wheeling around.
Right dress.
Battalion! Forward! March! Battalion! Charge! Bayonet!
All right, that is what's known as facing the cold steel. Bayonet charges could be very effective during the Civil War. It was rare that bayonets ever inflicted any casualties because it was such a frightening thing to see a line of men charging towards you with leveled bayonets that most of the time the defenders would just break and run away rather than actually face the cold steel like that. So again, even though there were few casualties inflicted by bayonets, they were a potent psychological weapon. All right, this concludes our demonstration here today. I want to reiterate what the ranger had said, that these men here are all volunteers. They're not Park Service employees. They are not your tax dollars at work. Their weapons, their uniforms, their equipment, the gunpowder they fired was all purchased at their own expense, and they're here on a very hot day. For the sole purpose of instructing their fellow citizens and other visitors in the history of the American Civil War. Thank you for your applause. We're going to be heading back to our camp, which is just across the road here, not far away at all. Please feel free to come along and you can take a closer look at our camp, our equipment and the weapons, and please talk to us. We're all very eager to talk to you. And thank you very much.
Somebody do that for me.
Oh, you can smoke it?
It's on again. Take that.
She's got Sal, you want to cover?
Where's the bird?
Come this way. Alright, we'll walk this way.
Pull it up real slow.
Alright, just hold on. Doesn't he look like a hot dog?
He's a hot dog. Lay down. Lay down. Lay down. Lay down. Lay down. Full concrete.